coming year is expected to be a relatively vibrant one for the South African agricultural scene, owing to expected good rainfall as well as increased sowing and harvesting. Supply-side factors are similarly favourable in ensuring adequate food availability over the next year. But for these positive cyclical trends to be sustained in South Africa over the medium to long term, we've got to start seeing supportive and well-considered agricultural policy come to the fore as well. Joining me in studio to discuss food security is Ernst Janovsky, who's head of AgriBusiness at Absa. Thanks so much, Ernst, for joining us this afternoon.
Yes. Well,
as I say, we've got this year forecast to be a relatively vibrant one for the agricultural scene in South Africa. Let's go through the factors at play, because first and foremost, what stands out is better weather conditions.
Look, Alishia, agriculture is always a part of the natural resource utilization, and unfortunately weather plays a major role in that. So yes, weather is always one of the factors that needs to be taken into consideration. And if you look at the forecast currently and you're looking at what we expect in terms of a potential La Nina developing again, we're basically back into the same seasonality than last year. A little bit late rains expected, a little bit tricky in terms of planting, maybe a little bit dryish in the planting season, but then it will normally take off in the second half of it, and that is when we actually need the rain.
How are we comparing locally compared to some of the global trends we're seeing on that supply side of things?
If you look globally in terms of supply, I think stock levels is as low as they've ever been in the world. But taking that into consideration, you've also got to look at what was changed over the last period in time. Basically, we moved from an era where stock was kept by governments to a large extent, and now it's been kept by the business itself, the agribusiness itself. And that means there's much more efficiencies in terms of the deliverance. And we actually don't see that price movement, although we've got lower stock levels. Yes, we saw a nice price movement because of the economic growth during the basically 2000 up to now, and we are now on a new plane of prices. But I think stock levels, I think, is not the problem currently. I think producers are profitable, and if they're profitable, they will start producing.
In the face of what kind of demand that's out there, because we've got global economies slowing down from the US to the EU right through to China, even even though what we're seeing in China is a more gradual slowdown than what we're seeing in the rest of these territories.
Alishia, one of the nice things about agriculture is if there's economic slowdown, you normally lose your job, and in the process you actually lose your car and your house in the process. But in agriculture, you don't see that demand faltering as much as you would see in a normal slowdown, because people still need to eat whether they've got a house or not. So at the end of the day, it's a much more tricky demand or sticky demand that you see there. So normally demand remains intact. What people will do is they will do a buy down. In other words, they won't buy the more expensive cuts of meat. They will start buying the more cheaper cuts of meat, or they'll change their shops.
Because obviously affordability then is becoming an issue, and then you're having an impact on the quality of food consumed. Does that necessarily translate into the quality of food that's produced?
No, definitely not. I think the quality is, because we're working biological things, at the end of the day, the standards that has to be kept up in terms of the production quality is still there. So I don't think there's any faltering in terms of quality. I think the grading and the necessary health situations that are monitored are still intact. That never changes throughout any process.
Yeah. Is there a distinction to be made between various crops, for example? So if we're looking at that side of things, and I ask because when it comes to crops like maize, for example, you've got relatively lower oil prices for now, undermining what was the economic viability of things like ethanol, for example. So that would impact the supply demand dynamic to an extent. And aside from that viability, there's also that pressure on the US, which is expected to result in a pullback for subsidies in ethanol production moving forward.
To be quite honest with you, I think that is the major play currently taking place, and that will put prices under pressure as some of those stocks are not being utilized by the ethanol plants anymore. And you'll see that move back into the food production side of it. So I'm quite optimistic that prices actually will remain where they are currently. I don't think they will be much lower than they are currently. I think they will just stick where they are, because stock levels throughout the world are relatively low. But it's still manageable.
It's one thing where you've got the weather, for example, playing in your favor. It is a cyclical trend, as you highlighted at the top of the show, and for it to be sustained, or the kind of trend that we're seeing right now to be sustained in South Africa over the medium to long term, as I said in the intro, you've got to have supported and then well-considered agricultural policy coming to the fore in tandem. What's the status in that regard?
I think, Alishia, if you really look at policy in South Africa, and I think this is what we're talking about, to sustain the production levels that we are currently having, is to get the policy out there, just get the rules of the game out there so we can start playing. And I think this is what's happened up to now, is that agriculture has been lagging behind in terms of policy, in terms of natural resource, access to natural resource. This is now basically the green paper in terms of land reform and so forth. I mean, it's taken us 14, 15 years to actually get to a point where we now can actually say we've now got something to start working towards. It is purely getting that policies in place, but it's also a fact that we need to get government to deliver on what they need to deliver in terms of the normal service delivery that they need to do. And here I'm thinking about, you know, vaccines that's been produced at Onderstepoort. We are using machines that are 40 years old. They don't get spares for it anymore, and therefore you get things that doesn't work anymore in terms of vaccines. And this has actually led to a situation where we've actually lost about 30% of production in the mutton industry because of vaccines not being up to scratch. So
still some of those barriers out there needing to be addressed, because they are preventing then the agricultural sector from functioning optimally. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the conversation there for this afternoon. Ernst, thanks so much for your time today.